What's more dangerous than a man with no power? A man who doesn't need anything from anyone. A man who rejects relationships, love, or even society itself. We think dependence makes us weak. But what happens when someone decides to need no one at all? We live in a world where relationships define us. Romantic love, friendships, family, even professional networks, they are the threads that weave our identity. Society constantly tells us to belong is to be human, to connect is to find meaning, and to love is to be complete. Without these ties, we're told we are incomplete, drifting, almost broken. But what if a man refuses this script? What if he looks at love, companionship, marriage, even friendship, and says, "No, I don't want it. Not out of failure, but out of choice." At first you might think that kind of man is harmless, maybe even pathetic, alone, empty. But history and philosophy suggest something else, that the man who rejects relationships is not just unusual. He can be far more dangerous than we realize. Because when a man severs his ties to others, he steps into a strange freedom, one that can lead to either wisdom or destruction. A freedom that unsettles society because it reveals a possibility most of us are too afraid to face, the possibility of needing no one. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." When a man rejects relationships, he rejects the tribe. He chooses exile, not by force, but by will. He walks away from the safety of belonging and embraces the silence of solitude. To most, this sounds like weakness, but Nietzsche's warning is clear. The tribe demands conformity, and the man who steps outside it threatens the very structure of the herd. Arthur Schopenhauer went further. He described love as nature's greatest trick, a biological trap that lures men and women into bonds of reproduction and responsibility. Love, in his eyes, was not some spiritual miracle, but an instinctive illusion designed to keep the species alive. To reject love, then, is to see through the veil. But here's the danger. When a man refuses the illusion, he also refuses the leash that tames him. The leash of duty, of compromise, of dependence. Most men are softened by relationships. They are bent into shape by the needs of a wife, the cries of a child, the pull of a community. Their wildness is tempered, their sharp edges dulled by compromise. But the man who says no does something radical. He cuts the tether. He no longer orbits anyone else's gravity. He drifts into his own orbit, a path determined only by his will. And this is where danger enters. Because a man unbound is a man unpredictable. He cannot be bribed with love, tamed by expectation, or chained by guilt. He is either free to rise above the herd in brilliance, or free to descend into chaos. And in that freedom lies a power that society both fears and cannot control. Think about it in today's world. We live in an age where loneliness has quietly become an epidemic. People are more connected digitally than at any other time in history, yet more disconnected emotionally than ever before. Marriage rates are falling, friendships are thinner, and families are fractured. In response, a new trend has emerged: relationship minimalism. More men are choosing solitude, not because they can't find connection, but because they no longer see its value. Some do this quietly. They retreat into solitude, fill their days with work, hobbies, or the glow of a screen. Others do it loudly, fueled by bitterness, embracing online movements that glorify detachment, the lone wolf archetype, the man who swears he needs no one. On the surface, it looks harmless. Let him be alone, we say, as if his withdrawal is just a personal preference. But here's the unsettling truth. A man with no attachments has no leverage points. You can't threaten to leave him because he doesn't need you. You can't shame him because he's already stepped outside your circle. You can't tempt him with affection because he rejected it before you ever offered. that man becomes untouchable, unpredictable, and in some cases, unstoppable. And we've seen this pattern before. Prophets who left families to wander deserts, revolutionaries who abandoned comfort to ignite wars of change, tyrants who severed every personal bond to devote themselves only to their vision. The man who steps away from love, approval, and belonging gains a strange power. It is the power of someone who cannot be manipulated by loss, and that makes him both fascinating and deeply dangerous. Carl Jung warned us about what happens when a man suppresses what he truly longs for. When a man rejects relationships not out of wisdom but out of bitterness, he risks creating what Jung called the shadow self, the part of us we deny, repress, and bury deep. But the shadow never dies. It waits. It feeds on rejection, envy, and alienation until it grows strong enough to burst out in destructive ways. This is what we see in the modern incel phenomenon. The man who loudly insists he doesn't want intimacy, who mocks love as weakness, yet secretly aches for it in silence. He scrolls through social media, watching others live the affection he feels denied, and inside him, loneliness twists into rage. That rage doesn't stay contained. It spills outward, into toxic communities, into anger at women, at society, even at himself. This kind of man is dangerous not because he has no desire, but because his desire has been corrupted by denial. His rejection is a mask hiding a deeper hunger. But there is another kind of man, rare but far more unsettling. He does not reject relationships out of bitterness, but out of clarity. He sees the illusion of attachment, the hidden chains of dependence, and he decides to walk away. He does not crave approval, does not beg for affection, does not measure his worth by connection. He builds his life like a fortress, walls high, gates locked, not out of fear, but out of freedom. And this kind of man cannot be touched. He cannot be bribed with love, threatened with abandonment, or guilted with responsibility. He has no weak spot to exploit. And when such a man finally chooses to act, for creation, for rebellion, or for destruction, he carries with him the most terrifying power of all, the power of someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. Look at the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius wrote about detachment, but even he was tied down by duty, empire, and family. He was a philosopher, yes, but also an emperor, chained by responsibility to Rome itself. Contrast that with Diogenes the cynic, the man who rejected society so completely that he lived in a barrel, begged for food, and laughed at power. When Alexander the Great stood before him and asked what he could give, Diogenes simply said, "Stand out of my sunlight." Imagine that, a man so free he could dismiss the most powerful ruler alive with nothing but indifference. Alexander, stunned, later admitted, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Why? Because Diogenes was untouchable. He needed nothing. No status, no wealth, no companionship. And that made him more powerful than the king of the known world. Or take Nietzsche himself, a man who rejected marriage, friendships, even his own health, isolating himself to chase visions of philosophy that still shape modern thought. His solitude gave him insight, but also madness. It burned him, but it also carved truths that society could not. These men embody the paradox. To reject relationships is to reject safety, but it is also to claim a kind of power society doesn't know how to handle, a power rooted in radical freedom. Here's the truth we don't like to admit. Relationships are chains. Soft chains, maybe even golden chains, but chains nonetheless. They bind us to care, to compromise, to behave. They make us cautious. Because when you have something, or someone, to lose, you cannot be fully free. You think twice before you act. You weigh consequences. You hesitate. But when a man rejects those chains, he steps into a terrifying kind of freedom. He either becomes enlightened or dangerous. Imagine fire. Contained in a fireplace, it warms. Contained in a lantern, it guides. But when it breaks free, when it refuses walls or boundaries, it burns cities to the ground. That's what happens when a man cuts himself loose from every tie. His energy is no longer directed by love, loyalty, or fear of loss. It becomes raw willpower, and raw willpower can create revolutions, philosophies, or disasters. Society quietly depends on relationships to keep men tame. A husband thinks of his wife before starting a fight. A father thinks of his children before risking his life. A friend thinks of his companions before abandoning a cause. These ties soften ambition and put limits on chaos. But the man with no wife, no children, no circle, no roots, he does not calculate the same way. He has no brakes. And here lies the paradox. The man who rejects relationships is both a potential saint and a potential monster. He can transcend into wisdom, like the monk who leaves the world to touch the divine, or he can descend into destruction, like the tyrant who feels no guilt because he owes nothing to anyone. That's why society fears the solitary man, because he has glimpsed a kind of freedom the rest of us can't imagine. A freedom where love, approval, belonging, all the currencies of human exchange are worthless. And in that freedom, he holds a power that terrifies, the power to walk away from everything. So, ask yourself, do you cling to relationships because you truly love them, or because you're terrified of who you'd be without them? Most people never dare to confront that question. They hide inside the comfort of connection, mistaking dependency for devotion. But the man who rejects relationships forces us to look deeper. He reminds us that we are not as free as we pretend to be. We're bound by invisible contracts of love, expectation, and fear of loneliness. And maybe the real danger isn't him at all. The real danger is the mirror he holds up, showing us a self we'd rather not see.